and universities. This program is presented by the American Center of Moscow, which is supported by the American Embassy in Moscow. If you are watching on the American Center's YouTube, VK, or Telegram channels, please post comments in your channel at any time, and we'll answer them as they come in. For Russian subtitles, you can select closed captioning in Russian. So today we're talking with Bob Efird. He is an associate professor of Russian in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures at Virginia Tech. And Bob, welcome to the show. Thanks a lot for inviting me. By way of introduction, I think it'd be interesting to start with hearing about what you teach at Virginia Tech, and tell us about your students and the Russian program and sort of what courses you teach. Well, I usually don't. I mean, there definitely are plenty of occasions, but I usually don't get a chance to teach language. Most of what I teach is Russian literature and Russian cinema. I do get to teach upper level Russian classes, which usually concentrate on cinema or literature in the original language. Very rarely I get to teach linguistic classes. Actually, next semester is the first time, I think, in about 10 years that I'm getting to teach beginning Russian again. It's been a long time. So, but most of your students in your literature and film classes, are they Russian majors? Are they in the Russian program, or do they come from all across the university? That depends on the level. If it's a fourth year Russian class, by that time a student has made a pretty serious commitment to learning Russian. So these are all Russian majors, occasionally Russian minors. There are some more general Russian culture classes which are more open to everybody. They tend to have more students from a lot of different backgrounds. It actually tends to be a pretty good recruiting tool for students that hadn't taken Russian before or hadn't even thought of taking Russian before, and essentially needed a culture course like this to fulfill a requirement, and got into it, loved it, and said, you know what, I think I should take the language. Who's better for recruiting, Dostoevsky or Tarkovsky? That would definitely be Dostoevsky. As hard as Dostoevsky is, Tarkovsky is a little bit harder to get into most of the time. I think for a lot of the students. Okay, well, speaking of recruiting students to the Russian program and to Russian studies and Russian interest, tell us how you first became interested in Russian. Well, actually, the previous answer kind of holds true for me too. I first got interested in learning the language and learning a lot more about the culture from Crime and Punishment, which, you know, a lot of the Russians I have spoken to have told me that that's what every American says. They've read Dostoevsky, they got interested in Russian. I think with a lot of my students, they had read things like Tom Clancy and somehow gotten interested in Russian. But for me, I was originally an English major, and I was very, very interested in 19th century English literature, like Charles Dickens, particularly William Blake. And I came across Crime and Punishment, and that pretty much changed everything. Within the next few months, I had read, you know, pretty much the rest of Dostoevsky's great novels, and thought kind of foolishly at the time, you know, it'd be great to read this in the original. Let's see if I can do it. And about 4 or 5 years later, I was finally able to do so. But that Dostoevsky was definitely for me the starting point. And I added Tolstoy to that pretty quickly, along with Gogol, Pushkin. But you were an undergraduate in college when this transition happened? Yeah. I was an undergrad. I was a freshman. You gave up your English major? Well, not completely. I ended up just switching it to a major. Luckily, by then I had done most of the coursework I needed to. Great. Yeah, I think that's it. It sounds like a pretty standard, you know, path to Russian. The same with me, only it was Brothers Karamazov and not Crime and Punishment.
So in your, let's talk about your courses then on literature. So Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, these are still fashionable writers in college courses, and this attracts a lot of students across the university, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, very much so. To be honest, it was a little bit of a surprise to me, because the first time I taught a course on Dostoevsky and Tolstoevsky, the first time I actually taught that, originally the course was not supposed to. Originally the course was supposed to have a different topic. I got into it a little bit late in the game. A large number of students had signed up for it. I think I had about 35 before I even decided what the topic was going to be. And this is not to my credit, but I thought 35, that's going to be some unwieldy grading. So I'll teach a course on Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. We will read War and Peace and the Brothers Karamazov. And as soon as the students see this, I'll sort of shave off some of the numbers. And yeah, the opposite ended up being true. I think I ended up with 42 students in that class. Many of whom were actually English majors that weren't able to get to these novels in their other classes. Yeah, it was actually kind of ironic the way that went out. But the course ended up being so popular, and as seems to happen every year, I got a lot out of it, just from different things that the students would notice. That again, I teach it every few years, and it's kind of like a great work of art where every time you look at it, you see something new, and that's kind of how teaching Tolstoy and Dostoevsky have been.
Do your students? All right, so Virginia Tech is in Southern Virginia. Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful school. I know that I'm wondering if there's a contingent of students, or if it's popular among students to look into Dostoevsky's spiritual or religious sort of views, and that conservative, if that conservative image that we often hear now about Dostoevsky, if that has become more of a theme when your students are studying him now.
It's a theme actually that I always bring up. Mm-hmm. In fact, the theological, as problematic as they can be issues in Dostoevsky, the philosophical issues are really what got me into it. And I really do spend a lot of time on that whenever I'm teaching Dostoevsky. And the students really do respond. Oddly, they're a little bit, they come at Tolstoy with a little bit more trepidation, I think. It's not uncommon to see Tolstoy as a little bit more didactic in terms of spirituality. Well, not uncommon, it's designed that way, actually. They tend to respond a little bit more favorably, I think, and openly to the religious, the spiritual aspects of Dostoevsky than they do to Tolstoy. I think a lot of them, particularly in teaching the Brothers Karamazov, can be very sympathetic to both sides of the argument. If talking about the questions of God, mm-hmm. Ivan Karamazov's arguments, how can God allow suffering? This is something that needs to be rejected. Whereas, Zosima, Alyosha is, they do have an answer, but it's not necessarily the one that everybody wants to hear. And the students, when they get challenged by that, and they don't often get challenged with that, they tend to respond very, very enthusiastically. We get a lot of great debates. Mm-hmm. It's usually not something when they sign up for the course that they're thinking of going into it.
Right.
I'm not too sure that the location of the university matters too much. We are out, in southwestern Virginia. We're kind of far away from a lot. The majority of our students, though, are from Northern Virginia, the urban centers up there. And the Tidewater area, Richmond. A lot of, I think of, well, what we tend to think of Southern American Christianity and that sort of cultural point of view tends not to figure in too much in their approach to it.
Yeah, I imagine I would have assumed that as well. So it sounds like you fall more on the Dostoevsky side of the Dostoevsky-Tolstoy divide. Is that fair?
Yeah, the best answer I've ever heard to that question was Gogol. I can't quite answer that, but I definitely appreciate it. I think had you asked me that question 10 years ago, I definitely would have said that. Maybe it has something to do with age, though. But the last time I read War and Peace was probably the most moving experience I've had with Tolstoy. I tend to see a lot more of what he's doing. It tends to, I think, it's easier to integrate with a number of different spiritual perspectives, I think. Easier than Dostoevsky, probably. So, I think I'm still very much on the fence. I can only give you an equivocal answer to that question. Really.
That's fine. I don't think that anyone has to answer that question. When was the first time you went to Russia?
It was summer of 1994. I was very much still in college. I say summer of 1994. We went to St. Petersburg, and it was freezing. So it didn't really seem too much like summer, other than the fact that it was light all the time. And it was, I think we were there about 5 or 6 days.
And who were you there? Like, what kind of a trip was it? What was the purpose of the?
Oh, yeah, it was not a study abroad. This was essentially on our own. I went with a bunch of friends, really just to check it out. I mean, it was very difficult to get a visa at the time. So we went through a tour group, which we ended up leaving a lot of the time to see things, well, very much to see Dostoevsky's apartment, to see his graves, to see other sites related to Gogol and Pushkin and, all the great 19th century literature sites.
So you went with a friend of literary buddies. So all of you all were on the same page visiting those sites?
Somewhat. Well, one of these people was my brother too.
Okay. That's cool. I mean, most of the time when I talk to people, they were there first for their research or for study abroad. You went there to check it out. So what were your impressions?
Well, other than the weather,
But you should expect that weather. Dostoevsky's Petersburg,
Yes, but until you experience it, I think it's kind of a different story. I mean, my first real experience with a Russian winter, I knew what I was in for, but actually being in the midst of it and being in that much cold was definitely something new. Really, my impressions were it was simply culture shock. Russia in 1994 was much different than Russia 2004. I wouldn't say it became westernized, but it really didn't seem as strange to me in 2004 as it did in 1994. Everything seemed to be different. The way people spoke to you, and my Russian at the time was terrible. I really can't brag about it. But everybody seemed to try, to speak with me, to show me things, to show me around. And it was nothing like an American city. It really wasn't much like a Western European city either, which is really until then all I had experienced. And
why Petersburg instead of Moscow for your first trip to Russia?
Yeah, that this is such a banal answer, but it was really for the sake of convenience. We had been going to Finland anyway, and from Finland to St. Petersburg through Vyborg was really not that bad of a trip.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was all convenience, but it really worked out for the main things I wanted to see were in St. Petersburg.
And those were like the literary sites.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah, of course. Did you So what were the highlights? Did you go to the Dostoevsky Museum? Did you go to Pushkin's Moika 12?
Yes, all of this. We went to the Alexander Nevsky Lavra, the Kazan Cathedral. We made a very, very quick stop at the Peter Paul Fortress. It's amazing how much of this I remember. It was literally 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so since then, you've been back. You've conducted research on your projects. What's been your professional experience? What did you study then in graduate school? What kind of research did you do in Russia?
It was actually kind of odd because I didn't, during most of my experience in graduate school, I didn't go to Russia at all. I did live between undergrad and graduate school. I lived for a year in Moldova. About, I think, 7.5, 8 months of that I lived in Pridnestrovia, in Tiraspol, which was very much like getting in a time machine and going back to the Soviet Union of the 1970s. There were statues of Lenin everywhere. In the Ovir office, there was a picture of Dzerzhinsky hanging on the wall, which was a little intimidating to a young American at the time. But I was there essentially teaching English and really trying to perfect my Russian. Following that, most of my experience came after graduate school, leading study abroad programs from Virginia Tech, always to Moscow. Most of my research I actually did here in the States, but there were a lot of hard to come by, impossible to come by books that I could really only get in Moscow. And going to some of the monasteries as well, trying to do some research on holy foolishness, yurodstva, in Russian culture too.
Is this what you wrote your dissertation on? What were you researching?
That it figured a little bit into my dissertation. My dissertation was actually on narrative theory and theology in the early works of Tarkovsky. But primarily, I almost went into the Russian. Ivan's Childhood and Andrei Rublev.
Great. So I didn't realize then that you had already, so that in graduate school you had become an expert on Tarkovsky. I thought that this perhaps had come later after you had started teaching literature. So what led then to your interest in Tarkovsky and Russian film?
Well, as far as Russian film, I think I had previously been very interested in Eisenstein. And really, particularly just for the sheer weirdness of it to American eyes, especially Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible 1 and 2, is kind of like nothing you've ever seen before. But really, my interest in film had started with Kurosawa. Right about the same time I started getting interested in Dostoevsky, I saw his film Ron, and I had no idea a movie could be like that or could do that. But I originally went to graduate school with the intention of studying Bakhtin and Dostoevsky. And I was actually in graduate school taking a film course, a course on Russian film. And the Tarkovsky film we watched was Ivan's Childhood. And it, to sound cliched, it totally blew me away. By the end of the film, I knew that I was going to change what I had been writing about, and I did.
Well, so tell me what changed.
Well, there were some things that I didn't quite abandon. I mean, obviously, I'm still very interested in Dostoevsky. I've done a few articles on Dostoevsky. I'm actually sort of doing the preliminary research for one right now too, as well as Bakhtin. immediately, I think the change was I need to learn more about cinema. I need to know more about how films work, film language, and what it is particularly about these films that is so much different. So while there are a lot of similarities in the approach that you use for literature, there is sort of this great structural difference that you get with film. And my sort of research learning focus shifted on absorbing that and really figuring out what that was.
So let's talk about Ivan's childhood, Ivanov Детство, and how that impacted you, because as we've talked about, and as I've known, often that is seen as, not Tarkovsky's best film, and sometimes it's dismissed. But for you, it had this big impact and brought you to Tarkovsky. What was your reaction to that film, and what is it about it that moved you so much?
It was the final sequence. Just trying to sort of make out what is going on here. I mean, the protagonist is supposed to be dead, but here he is, and yet then again, you also have this incredibly stark ending to it with the drum beat, the sort of not a fade to black, but really a sort of sharp, severe cut to black.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely works for me. At least it worked on a very non-discursive level. And then actually getting through it and studying it, one of the first things you learn is that a lot of the dismissal of Ivan's childhood comes from Tarkovsky himself. For the most part, he is an excellent commentator on his work, from a wide angle. When he's sort of describing what he's doing with time, and how he actually structures the narrative. It's rare that you get an artist who is so eloquent and accurate. But when he talks about individual films, you might as well ignore it. Ivan's childhood he dismissed as his qualifying examination. Part of the reason I wrote the book about it is to say there's a lot more to it than just this. Kind of don't listen to him when he says this.
Well, why did he consider it as, less than? And was that something that he said about it at the time he made it, or did this come later when he had already made these other great masterpieces, and then in comparison, that was less than?
Yeah, I think he had. Well, for one thing, I think the circumstances of making the film probably gave him that impression. It was, the film was originally being made by a different filmmaker,
Mm-hmm.
or the authorities just shut down production and sort of took it as a loss. And Tarkovsky took it on really on a completely shoestring budget. And of course, he worked with Konchalovsky too,
Mm-hmm.
on sort of putting the entire film together. And they did it very quickly, for what was Tarkovsky, an insanely small amount of money, with very, very little preparation too. I think it's probably natural that he would say, well, it's not a great film. It was my qualifying examination. Tarkovsky wasn't really somebody who would be quiet about his triumphs. But in this case, I think he was, he might have been a little bit overly modest. I mean, this was the Soviet film that really brought Tarkovsky and Soviet film back to the rest of the world when it won the Venice Film Festival. But also looking at it from his later aesthetics, he's not doing the same things in Ivan's childhood as he is in Andrei Rublev. And certainly not the films of the 70s, Solaris, Zerkala, Mirror, or Stalker. You don't have the same long takes. You have some, but the sort of long contemplative images that Tarkovsky really became known for later on are completely absent from this film. And I think that has a lot to do with his sort of, I wouldn't say wholesale dismissal, but just kind of saying it's not what it should be.
So he would train the camera on birch trees for just, a few seconds. And then he would say, well, I could do this for a whole minute.
Yeah.
It would be so much more impactful.
Yeah. Well, I think Ivan's childhood in a lot of ways is the film that let him do that. I mean, it brought him so much notoriety, and, he literally became world famous overnight. And that's really how he got to do Andrei Rublev, I think.
So what kind of training then did you have in film studies? So then you started taking more courses on film. I know in some of our preliminary conversations, I was asking you about film, Russian film, and your interest in Russian history. And it sounds like you approach Russian film and Russian and Soviet cinema very much from like a technical aspect, and what makes a good film versus, this is a Russian film and I'm into Russian, therefore I'm going to, study it. You really appreciate the art that's being created. So how did you develop that, and where did you find that most in your studies of Russian film, that artistic precision and point of view?
Wow, that's actually a really good question. I really didn't take very many film classes. I think in total, undergraduate and graduate school, I took a total of 3, which really wasn't that much. One of which, of course, didn't touch at all on Russian cinema. Actually, 2 of them didn't touch at all on Russian cinema. Yeah, I think part of the reason I come at it from a little bit of a more, I guess, technical standpoint is a little, I mean, I'd probably say about 10, 15 years ago, I was very, very interested in narrative theory. And if you look at the beginning, and I probably don't need to tell much of the audience this, if you look at the beginning of cinema itself, I mean, film language is essentially developed by Russian filmmakers. The Kuleshov effect is still alive and well in any film you see anywhere. But I think I saw a lot more of what was experimental or cutting edge, even if it wasn't going to be followed. I mean, I know I've mentioned Eisenstein before. We have plenty of films that will quote Eisenstein. I mean, anytime you see a baby carriage on a staircase, the quote is very, very obvious. But the way he puts a narrative together, the way he integrates different motifs and symbols, or even motions in Ivan the Terrible is incredibly compelling. There's so much difference, I think, between the way Eisenstein does this and the way Tarkovsky uses his ideas of associative linking. And I think around the time that I was really coming at Tarkovsky from a narratological standpoint, I also saw Russian Ark, Sokurov's film, which, in all honesty, the first time I saw it, it was on a DVD, and I think I turned it off halfway through. I got so bored. And then I think maybe 6 months or so later, I started thinking about it again, and realized it's a very unique film. Strictly in the technical way, it tells the story. I mean, the film opens with the protagonist opening his eyes, and you see him through his eyes. And the entirety of the narrative takes place while his eyes are open, and it ends when they close. And then, of course, he layers all of these different sheets of time, these different sheets of history in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg over each other. And I had never seen a narrative develop like that. And I think that definitely kept me in, with the Russian and the Soviet filmmakers. I feel the same way about Tarkovsky. I feel the same way about Parajanov too. And the way it actually developed, I hadn't really thought about it, but there's a direct line to the research I'm doing now, which is which is largely philosophy of mind, and different theories of consciousness. And Sokurov's work really kind of, I think, nudged me into taking a deeper look into both Parajanov and Tarkovsky and the way they deal with aesthetic models or cinematic models of consciousness.
Well, Tarkovsky and Parajanov, they were friends, weren't they? And I think Ivan Dietova influenced Parajanov's work.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see Tarkovsky in Parajanov's work?
No, honestly, I really don't. I mean, Parajanov would probably say yes. Yeah, I think he was pretty explicit about the influence of Ivan's childhood on Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors and The Color of Pomegranates. But really, the filmmaker I see the most in Parajanov is Fellini. I actually just rewatched Juliet of the Spirits not too long ago, and Fellini's fingerprints are all over Color of Pomegranates. The way the colors are used, some of the mise en scène, the setups are just they do owe a lot to Fellini. This isn't to say that Parajanov is not completely original, because he very much is. But I definitely see a lot more Fellini, a lot more Pasolini in Parajanov than I do Tarkovsky.
Let's go back to the beginnings of film, because you touched on how Russians played, the emergence of film and cinema was so strong. Russia's role in that was so important. And you teach a survey course, I think, on Russian film or Soviet film. What are the early films that you reference, and how do you sort of position? How do your students react when they realize that the Russian cinema was so influential in the early years of cinema?
Well, I usually go about as far back as the very, very early films of Nicholas II. There's an extremely old film of Tolstoy walking down a path.
You mean the filmed material or footage of Nicholas II?
Yeah,
and Tolstoy walking.
Yes, the originals, I guess. But of course, narrative cinema becomes, slightly different. We will show the Parajanov films, like The Queen of Spades, for instance. Actually, students really get a kick out of the old Queen of Spades films with Mozhukin in them. They're very, very creepy. But there's also,
I don't know those films. What are the Queen of Spades films?
These were, I'm pretty sure it was Parajanov, and I could be mistaken on this. But these are very old 19-teens silent films of the old Pushkin story. I'm sure they're on YouTube. They're very interesting films. The students really get a kick out of the way they sort of try to use the special effects and things like that. But we also do the very old film on Stenka Razin, which actually does look a little bit more primitive. It is essentially, staging a theatrical drama in front of a camera. But by the time we get to Kuleshov, and of course for an American audience, we always show them The Adventures of Mr. West in the Land of the Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
It's a classic, and the students adore it. To get a student to watch a silent film and really pay attention to it is no small task. But they are rapt in attention with this one.
That's a great one.
But really, when we get to Kuleshov and you start pointing out what he's doing with editing, light bulbs really start to go off. And they start to realize, wow, it really is a completely different language. And this is how films do this. Where people are positioned really does matter. When a camera cuts, it really does matter. And, they just they come at it from a new angle. And usually by that point in the semester, I've kind of got them.
Do you incorporate documentary in that as well? Like Zertov and others, when you think of editing and montage and, the Russian language.
Well, there's no way of escaping Vertov. Mm-hmm. He is a filmmaker that we always have to deal with on one level or another. I've got to say that, and it could be the way I teach it, but the man with the movie camera is really, with very few exceptions, I have trouble really getting students into it, because they tend to see it more as just a flat out documentary, rather than the really impressive work of art that it is. It might be the way I teach it. It might be the amount of time we have allotted. But I've really had a lot of trouble getting Vertov across to the students.
So of those early films, you mentioned Mr. West. What else? What are the other ones that really stand out for American students?
Well, Dovzhenko, of course. I've alternated between teaching Earth and between teaching Arsenal. Earth is always much more successful. The students definitely tend to relate to that quite a bit more. Pudovkin as well. I've definitely had some mixed results teaching Pudovkin. Usually we go through Mother, which is by any standard an absolutely brilliant film. Unfortunately, I think it really works out as sort of a chronological problem more than anything else. When we get to Pudovkin, we've just sort of blown them away with Kuleshov and how to construct a film, and we're coming up on Eisenstein. So Pudovkin, unfortunately, and it's definitely not something deserved, kind of gets squished in the middle.
Yeah, it gets squished there. Do your students, how much Russian and Soviet history do they know, or do they feel they need to know to appreciate some of these older films? Like I'm thinking of like Earth and collectivization and early Soviet history. Does that figure into the study of these films for your students?
It does. American students, and this is a generality, this is not always the case. I get plenty of students who are extremely well versed in Russian and East European history, but for the most part, it's almost a blank slate. They know there was a Soviet Union, but other than that, they don't know very many specifics. So we do kind of need to fill in the blanks for them as far as the early films go. Once we get to the Second World War, the lack of historical knowledge really becomes a little bit of a problem. Of course, all of our students know what the Second World War was. They know who fought. They knew which sides were on. Very few have any idea, the sort of massive scale of destruction and devastation in the Soviet Union and in Poland and really all of Eastern Europe. So once we start to enter the Stalinist period, and we do films like The Fall of Berlin, it's incredibly eye-opening for them. I mean, if we compare the numbers of around over 400,000 Americans die in World War II, but and of course estimates vary, but around 25 million Soviet citizens die in World War II. It immediately gets their attention. It's this amazing fact that they've never known before, and really they need that to go any further in these film courses, because so much of Russian and Soviet film is dedicated to the Second World War, understandably. So as far as the historical part, that part's the big one.
So what are the World War II films that you that you show them? I know the cranes are flying is on that list.
Yeah. I don't think any Virginia Tech student, whether they take my course or not, gets through the Russian program at Virginia Tech without watching Cranes Are Flying. We always show it, and rightly so. I mean, it's been played so many times that in a way it kind of loses its luster, but it's an absolutely brilliant film.
Do you think the ending of Ivanova Detstva is more impactful than the ending of Cranes Are Flying?
Well, it certainly is for me. I can't speak for everybody.
Mm-hmm. I'm only for you. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it seems more realistic to me.
Mm-hmm.
Although, my perspective is necessarily skewed. I found that, with students and having them compare the films too, they do love Cranes Are Flying. The heroine is, they just all adore her. As pissed off as they get at her at some points during the film, they really do all adore her. But I think they find Ivan's childhood a much more moving experience.
Interesting. I think when I think of Tarkovsky, I think a lot of indoor, snowing indoors in churches, and just these really, cinematic. He puts the cinematic in the word cinematic. But in The Cranes Are Flying, the scene where she runs up the stairs and opens the door to an empty, bombed out apartment. I mean, that's one of the most brilliant scenes in all of Russian film, I think, that I've seen. I love it.
I do too. And I would also add to that the scene with her running against the fence, and the camera tracking tracking her through the bars is amazing. Yeah. It's a great film. I would actually really love the chance too to show students the unsent letter with Kalatozov and Samoylova again too. It's something that they, due to time, again, we really just don't get a chance to watch, but it's something I always recommend to them.
Where do you send your students to watch these films? Do you have them in the library there, or do they watch them on YouTube? Or
I always request a special classroom. So we actually do have the grand screen, the good sound systems. So we get as much of a theatrical experience as possible. And unfortunately, it's really not realistic these days to have a special, in addition to class time, have a special period set aside where students go into a theater and watch the films. I try to encourage them to watch it on the big screens as much as possible. But logistically, it's getting more and more difficult.
So I know that you said you've taught Andrei Rublev before once, which is my favorite Tarkovsky film. That is something to see on the big screen. How did you and then actually, and you've done research on The Holy Fool. Tell us about how you approach Andrei Rublev and what your students thought of that and what kind of an impact that made, because that's famously difficult for audiences, but it's such a great film.
I'm probably going to have to get you to re-ask that question, because I have a bit of an aside, because Ivan's childhood was actually not the first Tarkovsky film I saw. It was Andrei Rublev. Okay. And I remember this very clearly. It was in college. We were snowed in and had an old VHS copy of it. And my Russian at the time was terrible. I could follow very little of what was going on. And it was an old VHS copy. The subtitles were white. The film is in black and white. Of course, it's Russia. Most of it is snow. And for the most part, I had no idea what was going on. I probably would have never come back to it had it not been for Ivan's childhood. But as far as the students in Andrei Rublev, when I am doing courses, sort of more general courses on Russian culture, and I talk about The Holy Fools, I always use Andrei Rublev, the character of the Durechka, the little fool. I'm always showing scenes with her. She really is a sort of great example to kind of get this through to the kids too. And they're able to follow it. Really getting them into Andrei Rublev, though, I doubt I would be very successful if I just handed them the film and said, go for it, make of it what you will. Usually start with some select scenes, just to sort of clue them in, I think, as to what's going on. There are the scenes with the ghost of Feofan, when he appears to Andrei, where it's snowing inside the cathedral. And Tarkovsky is doing a lot of very, very intricate choreography in that scene, where Feofan will appear in one space, at one point in the shot, and sort of miraculously appear in a different place in the same shot, which, it totally disrupts any spatiotemporal continuity, but only if you're really looking closely. And sort of getting the students to look closely at that, challenging them really seems to stimulate them. And they start looking, through the rest of the film for similar instances. And the same thing goes for the scene of the crucifixion in the snow, where you have this very, very snowy landscape and all of these really theatrically dressed angels hidden against the landscape. Usually what I'll do is I'll show them that scene and then say, did you guys see the angels? And of course, none of them do. And then we go back and it's like, look carefully here. And again, it's one of those moments where a light bulb's going off. And, at that point, I can pretty much say, okay, check out the rest of this film and tell me what else you see. And, when I talked earlier about looking at a great work of art for a second time and seeing things that you've never seen before, getting their perspectives on that has been incredibly valuable.
What is the most popular Tarkovsky film among your students?
I think it would probably be Solaris.
Really?
Solaris or Ivan's Childhood.
Not Stalker.
Stalker's a tough one. Really? I think right now Stalker is. I say right now because I tend to change my mind sometimes, but I really think Stalker is his masterpiece. I think it is kind of the culmination of everything that he did in cinema. Every frame is just brilliant. Getting the students into Stalker, however, and really encouraging them to be patient, because it's really not like Andrei Rublev. The structure of the narrative is completely different. To a certain extent, he abides by the classical unities. It takes place within what seems to be 24 hours. With some very, very, very short exceptions, it takes place within the zone. There's a very limited number of characters. And getting the students to really just sort of sit there, turn their brains off and focus, and to really just sort of surrender to the film's own logic is a little bit tougher than having them sort of struggle with Andrei Rublev. They really do have to come at it from a different angle. Solaris, given the science fiction aspects of it, they're a little bit more amenable to. Mirror, yeah. It's kind of, with a lot of the students, it's just kind of, well, just take the little things individually. Here's kind of what's happening. I don't expect you to love it yet. Someday you will.
And you said that Tarkovsky, in your opinion, has become even more revered over the last several years, and now is atop the pantheon of great world cinema filmmakers. I thought he was always there. I mean, what's changed in the last few years that has brought more people to him?
Well, in part, it could be just the people I was talking to too. It seemed like maybe 15 years ago, A lot of Russians I would speak with would say, well, I really loved Ivan's childhood, but I didn't like the rest of it. It's just too
much.
Yeah, it's too much. It's too out there. More and more, and it could be the colleagues I'm speaking with as well. A lot more people seem to take Tarkovsky on the same level that they do take Tolstoy or Gogol. Well, obviously not quite Pushkin yet, but we're getting. I can't really explain the change. I mean, there is a certain distance that comes with time, too. I think the scholarly attention that he's been getting too has been extremely serious. Within the last 20 or so years, you get a lot more serious scholars taking Tarkovsky very seriously. Slavoj Žižek, for instance, has a lot of very important things to Tarkovsky. More recently, Ian McGilchrist, for instance, the Scottish polymath, has called Tarkovsky one of the only Shakespearean artists of the 20th century. So it's not just Russia. I think a lot of, very serious people are taking Tarkovsky very seriously.
Very seriously.
That's what it is.
We have a question here. Has there been any kind of second life for Tarkovsky's unproduced screenplays or plans for adaptations? For example, Hoffmanniana, Master and Margarita. Does he have?
Yes, actually, he did mention that. And I think just as important to add to that list too is Idiot from Dostoevsky. If you actually look at his diaries, this film or the project for this film, it goes on almost for as long as he's keeping the diaries of making an adaptation for The Idiot, Hoffmannia. He also mentions Matryonin Dvor by Solzhenitsyn, Matryona's Home by Solzhenitsyn as another one that he was very interested in making, and I actually really wish he had. I think that would have been a really brilliant adaptation. Idiot probably would have been more difficult. I haven't really seen a whole lot of interest in the unproduced screenplays, though, and I think part of the reason may be that if we read the screenplays that Tarkovsky did produce and that he does have, they bear very little resemblance to the finished films. I mean, once he actually started to put this on celluloid, it's like everything changed. But it really would be interesting to see a study done of what Tarkovsky didn't do and what he had planned.
Another question. What do you think? Is the film culture forming the reality, or is it being formed by the reality itself?
I think it's always both.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's always a two-way street. I think if this is very much from the American cultural perspective, though, but I think if we get film culture influencing reality a little bit too much and we throw that balance off, we are in huge trouble.
Right.
But I really do think it is a two-way street.
Some of the favorite films that have come in from the audience, there's for Tarkovsky, there's a tie between Mirror and Stalker. Mm-hmm. And they've also mentioned the very same Munchausen, Autumn Marathon, and Burnt by the Sun.
Yeah. Just a couple words, though, on Mirror and Stalker. I do think, I think Stalker is his masterpiece. I think Mirror is definitely a close second. And if you ask me again next year, I'll probably have it reversed. But these really are his great films. Autumn Marathon, I'm sort of mixing the English and the Russian here. I almost said Marathon. But Autumn Marathon, it really is a great film. I have tried to get some student interest into that one too, and it hasn't quite quite worked. But one thing that actually has worked, and I think I mentioned this to you before, and I always suggest it to my students, is almost anything by Riazanov is a treasure. I absolutely love his films. I mean, I think, of course, everybody knows Ironia Судьбы или С легким паром. And, our students do tend to, get a chance to see that. But Берегись автомобиля, I think, is one that I wish I had more students really willing to sit through. The same thing with Garage, Служебный роман as well. It's just, I mean, they're just absolutely adorable films. It's kind of, for me, and I'm kind of I'm going a little bit far afield here from what you just brought up, but for me, Riazanov is kind of like reading Dickens. I don't care how artistically coherent or technically proficient it may be. I just have this abiding affection for them.
Well, and along with all those those heavy World War II films, I do know that you do put in a lot of you include a lot of interesting, fun, lighter films, including those. Also, the musical comedies. I understand those are very popular with your students. How do they relate to these Russian Soviet musical comedies? I'm thinking of like Jolly Fellows and Circus and Volga Volga.
Yes, the Grigory Alexandrov movies are, the ones you just mentioned. Actually, Svetly Put is their favorite.
Really?
Because they know the story already. Because it's exactly the Cinderella story, and the heroine, beginning from nothing, going to Moscow, eventually getting into a flying car. Circus, they tend to get shown a lot more, but as of the ones they actually study, Svetly Put is the one that they just love. I mean, we do sort of teach it as, well, this is, to a certain extent, this is propaganda, but at the same time, it really is an enjoyable, interesting film. And I think they really get a lot out of that too. Volga Volga, I've actually had some trouble teaching.
Really?
The Jolly Fellows, I've skipped over it some. I haven't taught that to the students. Volga Volga, I've tried. But I think the sort of this traveling troupe of musicians going up the Volga, to Moscow, if you point it out to them as a piece of socialist realism, they'll respond. But just as a film on its own merits, I really had a lot of trouble getting them that interested in it.
Do you ever use film adaptations of the novels to supplement your literature classes?
I have. It really hasn't been very successful though. I did use the more recent television serial of The Idiot in teaching Dostoevsky. The students really seem to struggle going back and forth though.
Mm-hmm.
We do get into a mindset, I think, when we see certain adaptations, that the book is always going to be better. Which, of course, if you've seen any Tarkovsky adaptation, is not true. But with The Idiot, it very much is true. So students, tend to spend a lot of time just kind of picking out, the discrepancies between the film and the novel, of course. Right. Trying to do this with Tolstoy, on the other hand, has been a little bit more successful. Students naturally have a very, very difficult time picturing what it looks like. What does early 19th century Russia look like when Napoleon invaded? And using the old Bondarchuk film for it, as well as the more recent BBC version of it. The more recent BBC version of it, especially because a lot of it was shot in Rundala Palace in Latvia, which is one of the sites where I take students on study abroad now. So they immediately recognize that. But really, other than trying to give them a sense of the physical atmosphere, I don't really use the adaptations that much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like what I like about the Russian adaptations is, like any adaptation, it gives you a view into what that society is focusing on, or
Mm-hmm.
what for them, what resonates from that novel.
Yeah.
What more recent films do your students watch and appreciate? More recent Russian films from the 2000s? Do you?
Well, if I think going back just a little bit, just before the 2000s, Brat, obviously the Balabanov film, was universally adored.
Mm-hmm.
And the second part, where he comes to America, of course, I loved that as well. Which, of course, it's not very surprising. After the 2000s, though, I've had a little bit of trouble with the students with the Zvagintsev films, for instance. And part of this is me. Возвращение, the return is, I recognize it's a good film, but it just doesn't quite speak to me. I think the same thing with Leviathan. I mean, I can recognize what is good about it, in some instances, what is great about it. But I couldn't really, again, I just can't really respond to it. I've had a diversity of opinions from students on it, though. The one Zvagintsev film that we all do agree on, though, is Yelena, which I think is absolutely brilliant. Particularly, the murder scene is as good as anything that has been done recently. I think it's just exceptionally shot and beautifully edited. Some of the more popular Russian films. One of the comments, I think, was Burnt by the Sun,
Right.
Which I thought was okay. I had a little bit of trouble getting students to respond to it. But Burnt by the Sun Part 2, I absolutely loved. I'm not that much of a Mikhalkov fan,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just such a glorious mess that you just kind of can't help but love this film. And I think the students responded to that as well. Another one that came out not too long ago that this really made an impression on the students was Konchalovsky's Дорогие товарищи, which we actually managed to show on the big screen, and I got a lot of great student responses from that. Purely from a visceral standpoint. So.
Right. Yeah, that's a good one. Well, thank you for sharing all of these insights. I think your students are lucky to not only to be able to watch all these great films, but to have your enthusiastic, mentorship as they're going through them. So thank you for that. And thank you for being here. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.
I definitely did. Okay. Yeah, I'm surprised the time flew by that quickly.
It flew by. We'll do it again. I have more questions. And thank you to everyone who was watching, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.
Thanks.